Mayday, mayday.
Well, hello, fellow pilots. I'm John King.
And I'm Martha King.
Martha, what in the world is all of this stuff?
Well, I've got a handheld GPS, a handheld radio, and my mobile phone.
Perfect. I'm hungry. Let's order a pizza.
Not now, John. I brought these along to add to our emergency survival kit so that we can determine our exact location and call for help if we ever have to make an off-airport landing.
Oh, well, I guess that's a good idea too, Martha, because today we're going to talk about emergencies. You know, how to handle them and how to keep your cool while you're doing what's necessary.
In this tape, we'll talk about your most feared emergencies and give you some easy-to-remember tips and procedures the pros use to help you cope with them.
And we'll give you some clear and concise procedures to follow to solve the problem and ward off panic.
Now, of course, much of what we're going to tell you is a supplement to your aircraft checklist and your pilot's operating handbook. But sometimes you've got to take action before you have time to read a book. We'll help you with those immediate action memory items.
You know, the very best time to deal with any emergency is before it happens, by thorough pre-flight planning. It's estimated that 85% of all accidents and incidents are caused by pilot error. That leaves only 15% due to mechanical failure. But I still call all of my incidents a mechanical failure. You know, a loose nut connecting the yoke and the throttle.
But even with the best planning, emergencies can arise, and the best way to be prepared to handle them is to practice the procedures before you need them. So let's get started and talk about some basic rules that will make the handling of any emergency go smoother.
There are only 2 rules for safe flight at any time, but those rules become especially important in an emergency. Well, what are those 2 simple rules? It's easy. Rule number 1 is keep it under control, and rule number 2 is don't hit anything. That's all there is to it, folks. It's that simple. So in an emergency, how do you follow those 2 simple rules? Well, you keep your priorities straight. Aviate, navigate, and communicate. Now, aviate means keep it under control. If you maintain the attitude of the aircraft, your airspeed and pretty much everything else will fall into place. Now, remember, in an emergency, that's the time to slow down. Be deliberate. Establish a workmanlike pace. There is no emergency so serious that you can't make it worse by rushing. On every flight, eventually you will contact the ground. It works out so much better if you do it under control. Navigate means don't hit anything. Keep it out of the trees and heading towards a landing site. And last and only last is communicate. Everybody in an emergency gets in a big rush to tell somebody on the ground about their problem. Well, there's no way in the world that someone on the ground can get in that airplane with you. This is one problem you're going to have to solve on your own, folks. It is true that ATC and flight service stations do have valuable tools that can be helpful, but they can't take the problem away from you. So remember, in an emergency, follow those 2 simple rules. Keep it under control and don't hit anything. And you do that by keeping your priorities straight. Aviate, navigate, and only last, communicate.
Let's talk about the difference in the terminology between land as soon as practicable versus land as soon as possible. You'll see those phrases occasionally in aircraft checklists, and we'll be using them as we talk about different kinds of emergencies. First of all, land as soon as practicable. What does practicable mean? Well, according to the dictionary, it means capable of being done with the available means, feasible. Land as soon as practicable is what you would want to do, for instance, if you had a rough-running engine. If your engine starts running rough on you, what you would want to be doing is looking for a suitable airport. Definitely an airport, and it looks like Cal's found one out over here, but definitely an airport that has long enough runways for your aircraft considering the wind and the conditions. Not necessarily an airport that has fuel or where you can get your airplane repaired or that takes your credit card or has transportation. And certainly not one that has the very best hamburger in town. What you do not want to be doing is you do not want to be continuing on an extended cross country. Land as soon as practicable means find a suitable airport and go ahead and land at it. Now note that we're saying practicable and not practical, because practical means something different. Practical means of or resulting from practice, and usually pilots have not practiced actual emergencies. Now, how about the phrase land as soon as possible? Possible, according to the dictionary, means that may or can be, that can be done. Land as soon as possible is what you would want to do if you had a fire or significant structural failure. You need to be looking in this case for the closest flat spot, and we've got one out here just short of that tree line. The nearest area that is relatively flat and that will hopefully result in minimal damage to the aircraft and to the occupants. If you've got a fire, if you've got a structural failure, things are very serious, and you have to get on the ground now in order to prevent a situation in which you might not be able to control the airplane all the way to the ground. So land as soon as possible means look for the closest flat spot and go ahead and land on it right away. So when should you declare an emergency? Whenever you, as pilot in command, think you need to get special help. Because the pilot in command is the final authority as to the operation of an aircraft. It's your call. It's your decision as to whether or not you need help. And don't be reluctant. Ask for help if you have any question at all about whether you might need it. Now, in the AIM, the FAA defines an emergency as either a distress or urgency situation. A distress situation means that you're threatened by serious and or imminent danger that requires immediate assistance. Things like an engine failure, a fire, structural damage. And there's no question in any pilot's mind when they're in a distress situation. They recognize it immediately. An urgency situation means you have a potential distress condition. You're concerned about your safety and you require timely but not immediate assistance. Now, you're in at least an urgency condition anytime you as pilot become doubtful about things like your position, where are you, your fuel endurance, the weather that is surrounding you, or any other condition that could adversely affect the safety of your flight. This is the time to ask for help, not after the situation has developed into a distress condition. Now, if you're already talking to somebody on the radio, stay in contact with them and just tell them what your problem is. But if you're not already in contact with a radio facility, you might want to use the emergency frequency of 121.5. And on your transponder, consider squawking 7700, which is the emergency transponder code. That will get you lots of help all of a sudden. So what kinds of help are available? Well, first of all, the person on the other end of that radio can give you advice and information. Air traffic control radar can pinpoint your position and give you radar vectors to an airport. Direction finding stations can do the same thing. Aircraft can actually be launched to find you and escort you to an airport. And if you end up in an off-airport landing, search and rescue aircraft can help help pinpoint your location and bring people out to get you out of trouble. And don't forget the value that other aircraft can give. Sometimes other aircraft may be the only people that will be able to hear you. Ground stations may not be within your range, and they can also give you advice and information and some suggestions. Now, the radio call, if you have an urgency situation, is pan, 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 pan. For a distress situation, the radio call is more familiar.
Mayday, 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 Cessna 359er Echo Sierra.
Niner Echo Sierra, this is Airstrip Unicom. Do you need help?
Barn Burner Niner here. What's your problem there, good buddy?
Niner Echo Sierra, San Diego Radio. State the nature of your emergency.
If you do call for help on the radio, you might, like Cal, get way too many answers, more than you can possibly deal with, and deal with your emergency too. Pick a person to talk with, and if you need to, tell everyone else to stand by.
Yes, San Diego Radio, Cessna 359er Echo Sierra, declaring an emergency.
Lots of pilots worry about declaring emergencies or calling for help because they're concerned about the amount of paperwork involved. Well, 9 times out of 10, there is no paperwork, and even if there is, that's tomorrow's problem. Take care of your emergency in a timely manner now, so that you can complain about the paperwork tomorrow. So that's the official word about emergencies. Now, let's talk about some of the things that might make us believe our situation fits the FAA's definition. The emergency that seems to worry pilots the most, although it's actually pretty rare, is an in-flight engine failure. If an engine failure does happen to you, you need to have a flow pattern established that you follow automatically to fly the airplane and try to restart the engine. Do this flow pattern at a deliberate and workmanlike pace. Rushing is likely to make things worse by having you do the wrong things. First, if you change something just before the engine quit, change it back. Undoing whatever it was may get the engine running again. An example of this would be if the engine failed when you pulled back on the throttle. In this case, you should push the throttle back in immediately. At this point, you don't want to know why the engine failed when you pulled back on the throttle. You just want the engine running again. And in fact, after you look down, you may find that the knob you had your hand on was actually the mixture, not the throttle. The second thing to do is to accept the fact that the engine has quit, because disbelief can keep you from acting promptly. Now let's watch John demonstrate the ABCs of what to do if the engine fails in a 172R. That's the one with a fuel-injected engine, and how to make an emergency landing.
Now, a good way to make sure that you do things in the right order during an engine-out emergency is remember the mnemonic ABC. Now, the first item of your ABCs for engine failure is A for airspeed. So you want to set the attitude to get you the best airspeed for a glide of about 65 knots. And if you remember, that attitude is having the bottom of the wings just about level with the horizon. Next is B for best field. And the first thing you want to do is head for the area where a successful landing might be possible. For instance, if we're about to fly over a big city, well, we might want to turn around and fly over farmland. And if we're about to fly over the mountains, we'd want to turn back to flat land. And everything else being equal, you'd like to head into the wind because you'd like to make your landing into the wind. Now, the last letter C is for cockpit checks, or the flow procedure. And you begin doing your cockpit check while you're looking for a landing site. Now, the procedure starts on the floor and moves across the panel, so we'll start on the floor and make sure that we have the fuel selector valve set to both. Push in on the fuel shutoff knob, push in on the mixture control, turn on the auxiliary boost pump, and make sure your magnetos are set to both. After you've done your flow procedure, starting at the floor, moving up to the panel and across to the left, well then it's time to refocus your attention outside the aircraft. Do you have the right attitude for a glide speed of about 65 knots? You can glance down at the airspeed indicator and verify that, and trim for the speed if you haven't done so already. Now, At this point, you should have your landing field picked out. And by the way, don't overlook any airports that you might be able to make. You'd feel awful silly if you overflew an airport to land in a field. Okay, I've got my field picked out, and I am sure there's no airport in my area, so I swear I've got to go to a field. So I've got my field picked out, and it looks like a pretty good one. It's plenty long. The surface looks okay. There might be some furrows, but I'll land along the furrows, and I'm going to be able to land into the wind. This is great. Now that I've picked out my landing area, I'll pick out my landing spot, and I'll plan to touch down on that field about 1/3 of the way down the field. And I can verify that I'm going to make that spot by making sure that it stays stationary in the windshield or moves down the windshield, but does not move up the windshield. Now, let's assume that we've done this flow check and the engine has not restarted. Well, if we have time and altitude, we can pick up the aircraft checklist and make sure that we haven't overlooked anything. Now, we should have already done all the memory items that are in boldface, but let's recheck and make sure we didn't skip anything. It says airspeed 65 knots, fuel shutoff valve on, fuel selector valve both, auxiliary fuel pump switch on, mixture rich, we've done all of those. And the last item on the checklist is ignition switch both. Now, what we can do is check to see if the switch might have failed. And we can do that by switching to right mag individually, then left mag individually. It didn't make any difference, so I'll go back to both. Apparently our problem was not the switch. Now we don't need to go to the start position because the engine's already windmilling, so that wouldn't do us any good. And now you've finished the checklist. Now once you've picked your landing site and you're heading towards it, try not to change your mind. It is far better to land under control at a less than ideal site than to lose control of the aircraft trying to go to a, quote, better landing site. Now, we've found our landing site. We're headed towards it, so let's make a radio call and let someone know that we're having a problem and that we're going to land off an airport. This might help us get rescued a little quicker. And since we've been not talking to anybody, let's use the emergency frequency of 121.5. Let's also put in the emergency code in our transponder, which is 7700. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cessna 359er Echo Sierra. We've had an engine failure and we're making an off-airport landing at 3 miles southeast of the Imperial Vortex. Well, that ought to get them out looking for us. Now we have time also to review the checklist for the emergency landing. Most important thing to do while we're reviewing this checklist is to remember, fly the airplane. So at all times, we've got to keep control of the airplane. Now let's go through that checklist for the emergency landing. It says passenger seat backs in the most upright position, and they are. Seats and belts secure, and they are. Airspeed 65 knots, we've got that nailed. It says 60 knots, flaps down. Well, we're going to hold the flaps until we make sure we make our landing area. It says mixture idle cutoff. I'll just simulate that by putting my hand on it. Same way with fuel selector valve off. I'll just simulate that by putting my hand on it. Ignition switch off. Once again, I'll simulate that. Wing flaps is required. I'm going to wait on the wing flaps until the landing is assured. And the next item is master switch off. I'm going to wait on that also because if I turn the master switch off, I won't be able to operate the flaps. And then it says door unlatch prior to landing. I'm not going to do it now. We'll simulate that. But what you want to do is unlatch the door and put a sweater or a cushion in it, something that won't let the door close on itself again. And then it says touchdown slightly tail low. I might figure that out on my own. And brakes apply heavily. I know I'd think of that. So what we have left to do now is put down the flaps, turn off the master switch, and land the airplane. Now, obviously, you don't want to be reading this checklist during this landing while you're touching down. So let's put the checklist away and do the rest of the items from memory. And by the way, once again, the most important thing you can do throughout this whole thing is fly the airplane. Now, all you have left to do is to maneuver your airplane to set up for final approach to your landing site. And as you get lower, keep looking for obstructions you might not have noticed from a higher altitude. You know, look for things like fences, wires, even signposts if you're landing on a road. Now, we're going to make sure that we aim for that 1/3 spot in our landing area. We certainly don't want to get too low and land short. And if we get too high, all we have to do is slip or use our flaps. If you get way too high, all you have to do is fly directly to the landing site, circle over it so as to pass downwind abeam the landing site, and then set up for a normal pattern, fly a normal pattern. So here we are on final, and it definitely looks good. In fact, I'm absolutely certain we can make the field with the flaps down. So let me go ahead and put the flaps down. And then when the flaps are down, I turn off my master switch. And this is neat. We have got it made.
Now, the flow procedure that John used works very well in a 172R, but different airplanes will require somewhat different flow procedures. You need to develop and practice a flow procedure that works for your airplane in accordance with the manufacturer's checklist. By the way, since the 172R is fuel injected, John obviously didn't have carburetor heat. But if the airplane you're flying has a carbureted engine, the first thing you'll want to do is get the carb heat on right away. That's because the most likely cause of your engine failure is carb ice. You must get the carb heat on soon before the manifold loses heat, and leave it on. Give it time to work. The second most likely cause of engine failure is the fuel. So as part of the flow check, you'll want to check anything associated with fuel or fuel delivery. If your airplane has a left and right position for the fuel selector rather than both, then always switch fuel tanks, regardless of what the fuel gauges read. Many accidents have occurred because of fuel starvation rather than fuel exhaustion. What's the difference? Well, fuel exhaustion means you don't have any more fuel in the tanks. On the other hand, fuel starvation means you have fuel, but it's not getting to the engine. The tank, even if it's not empty, might not be feeding fuel properly to the engine due to water or other fuel contamination. As John showed, if you're at a low density altitude, make sure the mixture is full rich. Maybe the engine quit because you leaned at altitude and didn't richen again when you descended. At a higher density altitude, you may actually need to lean the mixture. Especially when you're high and hot, full rich may cause the engine to quit altogether. And if your aircraft has a primer, make sure it's in and locked. By the way, a total engine failure is not what's most likely to happen. You're more likely to have the engine start running rough, maybe very rough, but still running. If that's the case, you'll still want to do the ABCs of engine failure and go through the flow procedure. The steps you follow to try and restart the engine are the same ones you use to troubleshoot a rough-running engine. So if your engine has a carburetor, put carb heat on right away. And if the engine runs rougher initially, then carb ice probably was the culprit. The engine will run rougher while it's ingesting water from the melting ice before it smooths out. Then check the mags, the mixture, switch tanks, and try changing your power setting. If you have a constant speed prop, try changing RPM. The engine may run smoother at a different manifold pressure RPM combination. Now, this is generally a land as soon as practicable situation. In other words, you're looking for an airport. Plan to land at the nearest suitable airport, like this one, rather than the nearest flat spot, provided the engine's not running so rough that you worry about it coming out of its mounts. You've not lost part of your prop, because that would give you an enormous amount of vibration. That the engine is putting out enough power to keep you airborne, and you can get to a suitable airport without crossing areas where it would be really hazardous to land. Don't be in a hurry to land off airport and turn a potential accident into an actual one. Now, if you do have to land off airport, as John said, you always want to land into the wind if possible. That's because a 20-knot wind means an additional 40 knots impact speed if you land downwind instead of into the wind. But if you need to, accept a downwind landing rather than risk losing control of the airplane while trying to maneuver to land into the wind. Now, what if your engine failure happens at night? You'll probably see some areas with lots of lights and some areas with no lights at all. Which should you aim for, the lighted or unlighted area? Well, the advantage of landing in a lighted area is that you're in or near a city, and that means population, which means that you can probably get help relatively quickly. However, there is a risk if you land in a lighted area to people on the ground. If you land in an unlighted area, there probably won't be any help available quickly, or at least might not be. And additionally, you can't tell what kind of surface you'll be landing on because you can't see it. It could be very rough terrain. On the other hand, it could be nice, welcoming, flat fields, or it could even be water. Go by your knowledge of the area. Failing any personal knowledge, go by anything you can glean from the charts. If it's an area of water of any significant size, it should show on the charts, and rough terrain should also. If you're in doubt, probably a good idea to try and land near the lights, because that way you're most likely to get help quickly. Now, when you get near the ground, turn your landing light on so you can see what the terrain is like. And then, as the saying goes, if you don't like what you see, turn it off again. Now, if you're flying a retractable gear airplane, like this sleek Mooney, when you're low enough to determine the surface condition, decide whether you want to land with the gear up or the gear down. But never put the gear down until landing in your chosen area is assured. If you do put the gear down for landing, the gear will absorb some of the energy of the landing impact. But if you're landing in deep snow, sand, or heavily rutted terrain, that may dictate leaving the gear up to lessen the possibility of cartwheeling. Now, on rough terrain, and that means anything rougher than the runway, hold the nose off as long as possible. That will reduce the airplane's tendency to nose over in soft or rough terrain. By the way, when landing on a beach, land in the wet sand near the water line. The sand will be firmer there, and you'll be less likely to cartwheel or flip. When landing off airport, what you want to focus on is maintaining the integrity of the cabin. After all, that's where the people are. Don't worry about what happens to the wings. Use them to dissipate energy if possible. If you're headed for the trees, aiming between them and hitting them with the wings will slow you down. But don't pick the only 2 trees in the field.
Now, if you do wind up on the ground, you'll want to do what these folks right here are doing, and that is leave the aircraft, because you may have just created a potential fire hazard and you want to get away from it. Now, if you wind up any direction other than right side up, when you release your seatbelt, do it carefully, because you could fall or your passenger could fall when they release their seatbelts. And the reason I say that is from experience. Martha and I one time wound up on our side on a car. I released her seatbelt, she fell on me. Believe me, it was painful. Now, consider all your exits, not just the main door. You can even use the baggage door, the way this passenger is right here. Windows work great too. You have to kick them out, or if you have a tow bar, that works very nicely to break out the windows. Now, if you have injured passengers, you want to move them away from any potential fire hazard. But when you do move passengers, move them very carefully. You don't know how they might be injured, and they could have a spinal cord injury. Now, just a few short seconds ago, you were in the air, and now you're on the ground. But even so, you're still in pretty good shape because you're prepared. You have with you a survival kit, you have a radio, and if it has a scanner function, you can use that scanner to find frequencies. You might even have a mobile phone, and if you have service in the area, you can just simply use that to call for help. And you have a GPS, so you can tell people exactly where you are when you call. So even though you are on the ground and things might look pretty bleak, you're still in great shape because you're prepared. Now let's assume you're taking off on a beautiful day like this for a fun flight, and just as soon as you get airborne, your engine quits. Well, let's acknowledge right now, you're not having a good day. What do? You do exactly what this pilot is doing. If you have runway left and you can possibly get it back down on some pavement, get it back down on the pavement, even if you run the risk of running off the end of the runway, because you'll do it at slow speed, you're on the ground, and your chances of getting hurt are much, much less. So if you have an engine quit on takeoff, the very first thing to consider is getting it back on the runway. But what if there's no runway left underneath you? What are you going to do now if you have an engine quit on takeoff? And the answer is you're going to go back to the ABCs. And that stands for airspeed for A. And by the way, for airspeed, do not worry about the airspeed indicator. Fly the proper attitude. Looking outside is far more important. So establish the attitude for the airspeed you want. B, as you remember, stands for best field. And we're going to look for the best place to put it down. And you might not have a lot of good choices, but we'll talk more about those later on. And C stands for cockpit checks. There is only one thing that I recommend you do. I recommend you switch tanks, because you won't have time for anything else, and 80% of all engine failures come about because of fuel starvation. So switch tanks and you'll give yourself the very best chance of getting that engine started. Now, don't do the rest of the cockpit checks unless you have a lot of time, because you really don't have time to troubleshoot. You should be flying the airplane and finding your best field. So the only cockpit check I recommend is switching those tanks. Now, where are you going to land if you have an engine quit right after takeoff? Well, unless you have at least 600 feet of altitude, you should land straight ahead or with a very small turn to maneuver to a good landing area. Definitely, you shouldn't be turning any more than about 60 degrees either side of the nose. Now, you may have some tough choices. You might have to choose trees over buildings. You might have to put it down in a flat area knowing that you're going to run into a fence or something. But the key is, don't try and save the airplane. Put yourself in a situation where you're not going to hurt yourself or anybody else on the ground. And if you have to hit trees to do that, so be it. Now, you might be asking, why don't I just simply turn back to the airport? Well, you can see for yourself. Go up to altitude and make a 180-degree gliding turn. We tried it, and we found out that in a Skyhawk, we lost 2 feet of altitude for every degree of turn. And that was in a 30-degree bank. We found that steeper banks, we lost more altitude in the turn. Now, when you make that turn back to the runway, it's going to take more than 180 degrees of turn. Because if you just turn back 180 degrees, you'll be lined up beside the runway, parallel to it, instead of lined up to land on the runway. So it's actually going to take you about 230 degrees of turn, which means you'll lose 2 feet of altitude for each one of those 230 degrees, or you're going to lose 460 feet of altitude just to get back to the airport environment, and you won't be lined up with your departure runway. But that's all right. Don't worry about it, except just making a turn back to the airport, because it's a flat area. There'll be knowledgeable people there to help you, and they might even have a crash truck. So that's a good way to go. Don't worry about getting lined up with the runway. Now, if you do have lots of altitude, you could turn back about 50 degrees and line up with the runway, but that would cost you another 100 feet of altitude. So to get lined up with the runway, your total altitude loss now is going to be 560 feet. Now, notice something else. You'll be landing down from the approach end of the runway. And that's okay too, because even if you do run off the far end of the runway, you're going to do it at low speed and you're not likely to get hurt. But what if you do have a lot of altitude and you'd like to get lined up with the runway closer to the approach end? Well, what you could do is continue this turn to make it a 270-degree turn, and then make a 90-degree turn back to the runway. But that's a full 360 degrees of turn. And that means your Skyhawk would lose, if you were doing this in a Skyhawk, a grand total of 720 feet of altitude. So let's sum up what we have learned. In a Skyhawk, just to get back to the airport environment is going to take 460 feet of altitude. To get lined up with the runway, you'd need 560 feet of altitude. And to get lined up with the runway closer to the approach end, you'd need 720 feet of altitude. So a good rule of thumb is, unless you have at least 600 feet of altitude, don't attempt to turn back even to the airport environment. Now, why did I say 600 feet when it only requires 460 feet? Well, folks, you weren't expecting this engine failure. That's to leave room for what we call the startle factor. Now, what if today you're having a truly bad day and you have an engine failure on an IFR departure? Well, you won't have a clue about which way to go unless you've done some planning in advance. And there is a tremendous tendency for pilots who fly IFR to never look at VFR charts. But it's a good idea to look at a sectional chart for the area you're flying in to plan where you'd go if you had an engine failure on takeoff when you're flying IFR. Now let's take a look at this area. This happens to be Brownfield in the San Diego area. Reba McEntire's band took off in a jet and hit this mountain right over here. They didn't have an engine failure, but they did hit that mountain. Now the problem is, to the east of this airport, you get into lumpy terrain very quickly. So if you had a choice, you would want to take off and fly to the west. Now notice in this particular case, you have a flat area here, but you get into population particularly soon, and up in here you have a flat area. So I would plan ahead and say, I'm going to take off to the west. If I have an engine failure, I'm going to turn to the right. Now, if you've done this in advance, found a flat, unpopulated area, you increase the odds of success in your favor tremendously. But regardless of whether you're VFR or IFR and how high you are, if you have an engine failure and follow the 2 cardinal rules of safe flight, you'll be a lot better off. Keep it under control and don't hit anything. Now let's assume that you have your engine fixed and you're back in the air flying again, and you're at fairly high altitude, and now once again, while you're at fairly high altitude, your engine quits. You are not having good times here, folks. But because your engine quit at higher altitude, you'll still want to do the ABCs, but you have a lot more time and many more options. So let's take a look at the differences a higher altitude will make. First of all, airspeed. You do want to fly the proper airspeed for glide for your airplane, because that'll make a big difference, and it makes much more difference when you're at higher altitude. Because at a higher altitude, you have a much greater chance of actually landing on an airport. And you can make a big difference in the distance you can glide by making sure you glide at the best speed for the weight that you are at. Because as you know, the pilot's operating handbook for an airplane gives you the glide speed for maximum gross weight. You'll probably be flying at less than maximum gross weight. So you'll want to reduce your glide speed by 5% for each 10% you are below gross weight. For instance, the glide speed for a 172R is 65 knots, but that is at maximum gross weight. Let's assume today that you're 20% less than maximum gross weight. Well, you'd want to reduce your glide speed by 10%, which would be 6 or 7 knots, and you'd probably want to fly at 58 or 59 knots. Well, that will make a big difference, and you'll be a lot more efficient. And the importance of this is even greater if you're flying a heavier airplane. So make sure that if you have plenty of time, because you're at higher altitude, calculate the proper speed for the weight that you're at right now. Now, let's talk about some other things you can do. You can do some things that reduce your drag. One source of drag is your propeller. So if you pull your prop control back, you'll point the propeller blades more into the wind, and therefore they'll be more feathered, and you'll reduce your prop drag. Close your cowl flaps. They create drag. Here's one that's kind of interesting. Even though your engine isn't running, if you put it at full throttle, you'll reduce the drag of the engine, because the engine is sucking against that closed throttle, and that takes power. If you open the throttle, the engine will spin more freely, even though the engine is not running. And if you have plenty of battery left, turn your alternator off, because that slows down the engine and creates drag. Now, you need to look for your best field. And at a higher altitude, you have a lot more time and a lot more options to finding an airport. And this is a great use for GPS, because most GPSs have a nearest function. Just punch that nearest button and you'll find out how far you are from the nearest airport. And in this particular case, we're only 8 miles away. So we'll head off to the nearest airport. Now let's assume that you arrive at your nearest airport, but you arrive too high to land. What will you do? Well, here's what you will do. First of all, you will not turn away from the airport and fly away from the airport. What you will do is select a landing spot 1/3 of the way down from the approach end of the runway. And then you will circle abeam that landing spot such that you can adjust your pattern and arrive ready to land downwind abeam the landing spot at 1,000 feet AGL. Then all you have to do is continue the circle and come in and land, and it's that easy. Now, here's another place where the extra altitude gives you more time to do a far better job, and that is with the cockpit checks. When you've got your glide speed established and you're headed towards an airport, you'll have a lot more time to do these cockpit checks and a much better chance as a result of getting the engine started. And don't forget to use your radio to make sure that someone will be waiting for you at the airport. After all, you'll probably need a ride into town.
Although pilots worry about an engine failure, there's actually one in-flight emergency that is more serious, and that is an in-flight fire. Now, the good news is you can prepare for it, and with preparation, you can greatly improve the outcome. How do you know when you have an engine fire? Well, you could smell oily smoke coming into the cockpit, and you might feel the heat. Now, let's follow John through the engine fire in-flight procedures for a Cessna 172.
Now, if you do have an in-flight fire, the first thing you want to do is quit pumping fuel up there. So right away, do a flow procedure to shut off fuel to the engine. You start at the pedestal, pull out the fuel shut-off valve, and then you reach up and pull the mixture to idle cutoff. And I'm not actually going to do that, but I'm going to simulate that by pulling out on the throttle here. And finally, turn off the master switch. And the reason you want to turn off the master switch is if you had a fire up there, it burnt the insulation off the wires, and that could cause a short that could reignite a fire. Now, you want to leave the magnetos on, and the reason you want to leave the magnetos on is you want to consume the fuel normally up there instead of having the fire consume it. So if the engine's running, leave it running that way. You want to try and isolate the fire from the cockpit right away, so shut off the cabin heat and air vents. Now, if you did have your engine running in the first place, well, you just shut it off. So in addition to your other problems, you also have an engine out emergency problem. Now, you don't want to attempt to restart the engine because you'd have to pump fuel up there again to do that, and that is not a good idea. Now, ask yourself at this point, did the fire go out? And if the fire went out, all you have now is an engine out emergency, so we'll go through the ABCs. A is for the attitude that gets you the correct airspeed, and that's wings level attitude. B is for best field, and at a minimum, all you want to do is head towards an area where a successful landing is probable. And C is for the cockpit checks. Now, we don't have to do the cockpit checks to figure out why the engine quit. We know why the engine quit. We just shut it off. So we don't need to worry about that. Now, if the fire did not go out, it's time to start getting this airplane down as fast as we can. And to do that, we're going to establish the airplane in a dive at 100 knots. And this 100-knot dive will do two things for us. First of all, it'll help get us down, which we really do want to do. And secondly, it might blow out the fire, which would be a good thing. Now, at this point, if time and altitude allow, you should pick up your checklist for the engine fire during flight. And it says bold items are mixture idle cutoff, fuel shut-off valve off, auxiliary fuel pump switch off, and master switch off. And we've done all of those items. Next, it says airspeed 100 knots. Well, we've got that already. And it says forced landing execute. I think we think of that on our own, don't you?
It's very important to know the exact engine fire and emergency descent procedures that the manufacturer recommends for your aircraft. For instance, as John said, in the 172R, Cessna recommends descending at 100 knots. But if the fire is not extinguished, try increasing your speed within the airspeed limitations to try to reach a speed that will result in an incombustible mixture. For the Mooney M20J, Mooney recommends beginning at best glide speed and then, if the fire isn't extinguished, increasing the speed, just like for the 172. Now, if the fire did not go out, You really want that airplane on the ground in a hurry. This is unquestionably a land as soon as possible situation, and that means you need to get the airplane on the ground immediately to avoid the hazards of smoke, heat, and the possibility of engine mount or other structural failure from the fire. Now, the manufacturer may recommend descending in a clean configuration at the fastest airspeed for the conditions, as Cessna does for the 172 and Mooney allows for the M20J. On the other hand, the manufacturer may recommend descending with the gear extended, as in the 172 RG. Mooney prefers, by the way, this configuration, the gear down, for the M20J. Some manufacturers also have you use partial flaps, like Cessna recommends in the 182 RG. You see why you need to know the procedures for your airplane. If you do extend the gear and/or the flaps, you'll now be contending with the gear and flap speed limitations. You don't want pieces of the airplane departing during your descent. Now consider using a bank of 30 to 45 degrees for the descent. The bank helps you dump lift by increasing your rate of descent, but be careful not to end up in a tightening spiral. And if you put the airplane in that bank before you start the descent, it will help maintain positive G's and keep from bouncing everyone off the cabin roof. And now you have some tools to cope with the most serious emergency in the air, an engine fire. Now, how do you know when you have an electrical fire instead of an engine fire? Well, an electrical fire has a very characteristic acrid odor that comes from burning insulation. So if you smell that acrid odor, immediately turn the master switch off. Then turn all the other switches off, including the on-off knobs for each individual radio. Now, because of the fire, you may be having trouble breathing due to the cabin air contamination. In that case, you may want to open the window. But be aware that that could also feed oxygen to the fire if it's not out yet. If you have a fire extinguisher available, and if you think the fire's not out yet, go ahead and use it. But be sure to ventilate the cabin after using to get rid of the residue. Now try to isolate the bad circuit or equipment, and the way you do that is by turning the master on and reinstating the equipment one item at a time, with a pause as you turn each one on to see if the smoke or fire returns, and be ready to turn the switch off again if it does. If a circuit breaker has popped, do not reset it. You've probably found the source of your fire. Now, as you turn the equipment back on, your priority is to try one comm radio first, because what you want to do is have a radio available in order to communicate with people and get into that airport you're going to head for. You want to turn on, as you're doing this process, the minimum equipment that you need to get yourself safely to an airport. And once you have everything under control, land as soon as practicable. Remember, that means at the nearest suitable airport. And as you proceed to the airport, evaluate the effects of the loss of any equipment that you won't have on, such as additional comm or nav radios, maybe your transponder, possibly the flaps or your landing gear. The other type of fire that you might get in flight is a fire in the cabin of the aircraft, in the upholstery or the carpet or loose papers. And it might start because you've got loose paper up against something hot in the avionics, or maybe a passenger dropped a cigarette. This is about the only time that a leftover cup of cold coffee will come in really handy. If you have a fire extinguisher in the cabin, go ahead and use it to put the fire out. And remember to ventilate the cabin to get rid of the residue when you're done. If you do not have a fire extinguisher, try and smother the fire with a blanket or jacket or some heavy-duty clothing that won't burn. If you do not get the fire out, What you need to do then is land as soon as possible. This is a critical situation where smoke and fumes could overcome you if you don't get on the ground quickly. Besides, you've got no idea what the fire might be doing to your control system.
Now let's talk about getting lost. Lost, you say? How could anyone get lost today with the navigation equipment we have? With GPS, we all know exactly where we are all the time. Well, let me tell you, the chances of getting completely, hopelessly, even pathetically lost are greater now than they have ever been before. And the reason is that wonderful equipment, because there's a tendency to sit there fat, dumb, and happy and watch the miles click away on the GPS. And the only thing you know about where you are is that you're, say, 298 miles from your destination, if you even know that. And that leaves a lot of us just one equipment failure away from being completely lost. And some of us won't even have a chart out when it happens. Well, you can always console yourself with the line, lost? I'm not lost. I know exactly where I am. I'm sitting right here in this seat. I just seem to have misplaced everything else. Well, let's talk about what you do if you seem to have misplaced everything outside those cockpit windows. Now, you'll know for sure you're lost when you find yourself looking outside the window at features and trying to find them on your chart. Because when you're not lost, you know where you are in the chart, and you just use the features outside to verify your position. Well, if you think you are lost, the first thing to do is hold your heading, because at one time you figured this heading would take you to your destination. Well, it probably still will. And it may be that you're not really lost at all. It could be that you're just having trouble making the chart look like the real world. For example, seasonal changes make a big difference. So stay calm, don't panic. Getting flustered is just going to make things worse. And climb if weather allows, because as you go to higher altitudes, you can see patterns and landmarks easier. And now is the time to think big, because you want to look at big features like mountains and lakes and rivers, and then compare those big features to the chart. For instance, if you looked at a mountain, look at contour lines, and you can see that mountain on the chart, and you're beginning to know where you are. So look at big features, rivers, lakes, mountains, things like that. And also look for bracketing boundaries. You could have figured out in advance that you had a road to the south and you might have had some mountains over here. And if you find yourself over an east-west road, well, there's only one east-west road in the area, so you know you're at that area. So use those bracketing boundaries. Another thing you can do is dead reckon from your last known position. Now let's assume that you had the good sense to write down the time when you were over this airport right here, and you know exactly where you were. Now you figure out what the wind may have done to you. Estimate your wind drift. For instance, you can look on the ground at dust or smoke, look at trees they might be bending over, look at ripples on lakes, look at your crab angle that you've been flying at, and estimate what the wind drift is. Well, with that information, now you can dead reckon from your known position to an estimated position. For instance, let's assume that we had a 120-knot airplane and we knew we were at this position 30 minutes ago. Let's assume we've been flying east. Well, 30 minutes, you'd be about 60 miles to the east. 60 miles, that's 1 degree of latitude. So here's 39 degrees, here's 40 degrees. All we have to do is transpose that over here, and we know we're going to be somewhere in this area right here. How about wind drift? Well, let's assume that we figured out we had a 20-knot wind. In 30 minutes, it might have drifted us, we'll say, 10 miles. Well, here's 10 miles right here, so it could have drifted us about in a radius like this. So we know we're in this area around here, so now we can go back to these big features and identify where we are, and we can do it all because we had the presence of mind to write down the time when we passed our last known position. Now, if after you've done all of this, you're still lost, it's time to use the 4 C's, and they are climb, conserve, confess, and comply. Now, climbing is always a great idea when you're uncertain of your position because climbing gives you a wider area of view and it gives you more range to receive common nav frequencies. So climbing is a wonderful idea. Next is conserve fuel, and do this at least until you know you're okay on fuel, because fuel is a very precious commodity in a situation like this, and you just might need it later on. How do you conserve fuel? Well, you fly your best endurance speed, and you have to know what that is for your airplane. You lean your mixture as much as you can, and you use a low RPM if you have a constant speed propeller instead of a high RPM, because at the same power output, a low RPM will use less fuel. Now, if fuel gets very low, consider a precautionary landing with the engine running rather than an emergency landing with the engine out. And by the way, statistics show a much higher injury and fatality rate for emergency landings due to fuel exhaustion than any other kind. And I think the reason is the pilot is saying to himself, boy, am I dumb. Boy, am I really dumb. And that is no frame of mind in which to perform your best. So if you ever get in a situation like this, keep telling yourself how good you are, because that's the frame of mind that you need to be in. Then confess, because the people on the ground can help you. Tell them your problem. They have tools like radar that can be very, very useful. How do you reach the people on the ground? Well, you can use the universal frequency for flight service stations, which is 122.2, or you can use the universal emergency frequency, which is 121.5. Or you can call the centers directly, and the centers, you can look up their frequency on IFR charts, or if you were smart enough to bring an airport facility directory with you, you can look it up there. We're on the back page of the airport facility directory. Centers are called Air Route Traffic Control Centers, or ARTCC. There is a tab for that, so now you pick it up at that tab and go find centers, and here's, for instance, Albuquerque Center, and here are all their transmitter sites. If you have a rough idea of where you are, you'll now know a frequency that will work. And when you have contacted somebody on the ground, comply. They'll give you headings to fly to an airport. If you don't fly them, it won't do any good, so make sure you comply. Now, if you do get lost, then just follow these procedures and use all your resources, including those on the ground, and you'll be okay.
Now, when we think of our most feared emergencies, one emergency that comes to mind for most pilots is an accidental stall. And a stall near the ground can be a really bad deal because you might not have room to recover. Now, one place pilots have been known to stall at low altitudes is in the traffic pattern. So we all need to be especially careful when we're turning from base to final and when we're turning out of the pattern after takeoff. Another time that stalls get pilots into trouble is when they're sightseeing near the ground, say when they're circling over a friend's house or some other landmark on the ground. Now, sometimes the airplane is talking to a pilot, telling him he's flying too slow, but the pilot just doesn't listen. So let's review the clues an airplane gives you and cover basic stall recovery. Now, as the airplane slows down, there are a few things that you can pay attention to that will help you know that you're in slow flight. First of all, there's a lot less air rushing over the cockpit, so the aircraft is a lot quieter. Now, as the airplane slows, the airplane will want to descend on its own. Now, as the airplane slows down even further, you can begin to notice that the engine seems to be laboring. It's working a little harder for the same RPM. And the airplane is much less responsive now. The controls are kind of mushy, so you'll notice that, and that's a clue that you're flying slow. If I get slow enough, the stall warning horn will begin to come on. And when the stall warning horn comes on, you might also notice at the same time the airflow begins to buffet the tail just a little bit because we have some disturbed air over the wings. Now, the airplane has given us some pretty good clues that we're near a stall. If we do happen to stall the airplane, all we have to do is lower the nose and add power. Come in with right rudder, and if we have any bank, use coordinated controls to level the wings. And now we have air flowing smoothly over the wings, and we're flying once again.
That was a stall. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is stalling an airplane in uncoordinated flight. Now, if you're going to go around stalling an airplane in uncoordinated flight, you just might find it handy to know how to recover from a spin? Well, to get out of a spin in any airplane, you just have to do three things. First of all, you have to stop the rotation, then you break the stall, and finally, you recover from the dive and smoothly return to straight and level flight. Now, the specific instructions for getting out of a spin in a Skyhawk go like this. If it's not already there, after you've entered that spin, bring the throttle back to idle. Then be sure to place the ailerons in neutral. Then apply and hold full rudder opposite the spin direction. And just after that rudder reaches the stop, move the elevator control briskly forward to break the stall. And hold these control positions until the rotation stops. Then neutralize the rudder and very smoothly recover from that dive. And that's all there is to it. Obviously, that fun spin recovery was in a Cessna 172, but spin recovery for most airplanes is the same, but you need to know the procedures for your own airplane. And by the way, once you learn those procedures, you must have confidence in them, because once you make the proper control inputs, in some airplanes there can be quite a bit of a delay before it responds. In fact, in a Tomahawk, like this airplane right here, the rotation tightens just before it comes out of the spin, so you think things are worse instead of better. Also, you'll notice when you recover from a spin, you're very nose down and you wind up in a very steep, almost vertical dive. And you're going to pick up a lot of speed. So you want to be careful that you don't overstress the aircraft. Be smooth with your control inputs. Now, here is something we all ought to consider doing, and that is go out in an aerobatic airplane with an aerobatic CFI, the airplane's properly equipped, and practice getting into and out of spins. Do that, and we'll all be very comfortable with recovering from spins.
Now remember, there are only 2 rules of safe flying. Keep it under control and don't hit anything. No matter what else happens, that's all you have to do to be safe. Well, that wraps up our first tape in the Emergencies series, Surviving Your Most Feared Emergencies.
Now, we sincerely hope that none of these emergencies ever happens to you. But if one should, we hope we've given you everything you need to deal with it with the confidence of an old pro. Now, in the second tape of this 3-part series, we'll give you what you need to deal with emergencies caused by systems failures. And in the third tape, we'll get you prepared to deal with emergencies that can be caused by nature's wrath. Now, being prepared to handle emergencies like an old pro is really great. But real pros know the trick is avoiding emergencies.
As you know, 85% of all accidents are caused by the pilot, not the aircraft. In fact, most stressful and dangerous situations that occur in the air come about because of bad decisions or failure to even make decisions right here on the ground before you even start. So we suggest that you develop your own personal checklist to use before you take off. In the next tape in our emergency series, we'll talk about developing a personal checklist. But for now, let's find out how John's doing with his forced landing in the wilderness.
Hello, directory assistants? Yes, do you have a number for wilderness pizza? Oh, you do? Great. 555-2639. Thank you very much. Wow, the reception up here is great. You know, I hope they deliver.
Folks, have fun in your flying. Keep the pointy end forward, the dirty side down, and by all means, please, don't be like John. Stay out of the trees.
Can win this sensational Skyhawk. A first-class Cessna for the new millennium, this 172 SP Skyhawk Millennium Edition has been refined and enhanced to new levels of comfort and performance. This is the famous airplane featured in King School's videos, and best of all, it can be yours. This fully loaded Skyhawk comes equipped with the deluxe Bendix King Avionics IFR package. The cornerstone of this reliable system is the KLN 94 IFR Approach Certified GPS with a built-in color moving map, 2 KX155A Navcom transceivers, audio panel with marker beacon lights, 4-place voice-activated intercom, and the KAP 140 dual-axis autopilot round out this solid electronics package. Your 180 horsepower fuel-injected Lycoming engine will whisk you away to your favorite destination. On your journey, enjoy first-class comfort with a special Millennium Edition leather interior, an acoustically soundproofed cabin, and sweeping panoramic views with the 360-degree wraparound windows. The Millennium Special Rosen Premium Sun Visors cut overhead glare and improve pilot visibility. The panel and overhead lighting elevate night flying to new heights of enjoyment. You'll be the talk of the airport if you win this Millennium Edition Skyhawk. But to win, you must enter the King Schools Microsoft Win a Cessna Millennium Edition Skyhawk sweepstakes. And your order of any King course automatically enters you to win. No matter where you are in your flying, King has a course for you. Point and click your way to an ace with King's new interactive CD-ROM courses. Our CD-ROM courses are revolutionary, easy-to-use programs that are the most fun way to prepare for the FAA knowledge test. Your menu displays your path to understanding every single fact you need to build your knowledge and confidence. And the best part is, you don't just sit back and watch, you actually participate. Just pick a subject area, and the program guides you to your next lesson. Each lesson features full-screen, full-motion video in easy-to-digest snippets right on your computer screen. You'll love King's clear and concise presentations, loaded with evocative examples, monster graphics, in-flight video, fun memory aids, and humor. You'll always have instant control of the video. No more rewinding or fast-forwarding. When you've seen the video, the program will serve up the actual FAA questions covering the snippet you just watched. Pick the correct answer, and the program advances you to the next question. Choose an incorrect answer, and the software immediately provides you with the right answer. With a touch of a button, you can instantly review the appropriate video clip, read the textual explanation, or simply proceed to the next question or even the next lesson. Portable and convenient, you can prepare anywhere. And the whole time, the computer keeps track of your progress until you're totally prepped and ready to confidently take your FAA exam. Plus, you'll have free software support as long as you own your course. Prefer a videotape course? Then King's highly acclaimed video courses are an economical way to make learning easy, interesting, and fun. After you've taken your King videotape course, let King's computerized exam review make it fun to ensure a Top Gun score. This easy-to-use program lets you choose questions by subject, select previously missed or unanswered questions, or take them all. Then receive on screen the correct answer and King's comprehensive detailed explanation at any time with the touch of a button. Your computer will track your progress, and King's report card highlights areas to concentrate on to improve your score. When it's time to get ready for your check ride, let King's flight test courses help ensure your success. An actual FAA examiner tells you what is expected for every task, and your instructor shows you how to demonstrate your knowledge on the ground and in the air. When you need your next biennial, cut through the clutter and guesswork. Breeze through your BFR in just a few hours with King's VFR and IFR flight review courses. And if you're ready to step up to twins, then you'll enjoy King's multi-engine flying. This two-tape set gives you the knowledge you need and supplies you with the do's and don'ts of safe multi-engine operation. Our exciting takeoff videos take you beyond the FAA knowledge test. Choose from a growing library of informative and entertaining videos, including navigation from A to Z, the popular VFR cross-country flying, communications, and the latest, the Emergency series, surviving your most feared emergencies and surviving systems failures. You have 3 easy ways to stay on top of the latest special offer that King Schools has in store for you. First, keep an eye on your mailbox for your personal copy of King Schools catalog. Next, you can log on to www.kingschools.com, where you can easily order any of our products with confidence and security directly from King Schools 24 hours a day. Or best of all, call 1-800-854-1001 and one of our friendly customer service representatives, fellow pilots there to help you, can assist you in finding the right product for you. So call 1-800-854-1001 now. That's 1-800-854-1001, and you can win this Millennium Edition Skyhawk.